During this video, we'll cover the process of removing the plenum, also known as the upper intake manifold, from a 2002 Nissan Maxima. This process is required for you to gain access to the 3 spark plugs towards the rear of the motor, also for you to gain access to the rear valve cover. Here are some of the supplies you're going to need if you're interested in replacing the rear valve cover on this vehicle. You can see a series of ratchets, also this upper plenum gasket, which is suggested to be replaced according to the Haynes service manual that I have. You can also see the valve cover gasket, as well as the rear valve cover. You can also need the ultra black Permatex silicone for this job. The torque wrench that you see here, I needed because the ones I had could not measure down to 9 to 26 inch-pounds, which is required for this job. There's been a lot of stories you'll read about on the web of people over-torquing the bolts when replacing the valve cover. Here you see a series of sockets, breaker bars, a couple more ratchets, pliers, and the hex bit sockets. Those are required for you to remove the engine cover. I also have the masking tape there that you'll see me use throughout the video for me to keep track of some of the hoses that are removed. The brake clean I used also to clean off certain parts while I had access to them. So the first step here is to remove the engine cover. Here you're going to see the 4 hex bolts, which we're going to remove to get access to that plenum. You'll also notice here in the engine cabin that I have a strut brace. That one's just held down by 2 bolts, but your vehicle, if it's all OEM, shouldn't have that. Our next step will be to remove the connector for the negative battery terminal. This is one of the more trickier portions of the job. There are 2 bolts that attach the plenum to a bracket. Here I'm using a 1/2 inch breaker bar to get behind this bracket and detach the 2 bolts. This breaker bar also has a little bit of a joint that allows it to reach behind the plenum and undo the bolt, and eventually with my hands I also unscrewed the bolt. So this was a tricky portion of the job. So during this next phase of the job, there are going to be 2 components attached to the top of the plenum. Here you see me just removing the bolts for them and just moving them out of the way, because we're going to try to move the plenum up and over to the right so that we have access to the rear valve cover. There you see me also making use of the masking tape. There are various hoses that were disconnected from the plenum, and even though it's just a couple of them, you'd be surprised at how disoriented you could get later on when it's time to replace the plenum after you've gone in there, you've removed the spark plugs and taken off the rear valve cover, and you're working on that gasket. It was probably a couple hours later for me when I was putting this plenum back in place. So this was really helpful, and I would suggest this. Get a little roll of masking tape. Cost me like $1 or $2 at Home Depot, and it really went a long way. So here once again we're making our way to the back of the plenum, removing various hoses. The back there you'll also see the connection from the plenum going to the PCV valve of the rear valve cover. That pliers that you see there, that was very helpful in removing many of the hoses on this system. Once again, there I am using that technique again of making sure that all of those hoses are labeled on both sides. Once again on the hose, and then on the other side, whether it was attached to the plenum or any other piece of equipment. So this portion of the video, we're going to go ahead and begin to remove the bolts that are holding the plenum down. There are a total of 4 bolts. We can also see that there are a couple of hoses left there that are also labeled. The air filter housing has a clamp on it. All you have to do is just unscrew that clamp just to loosen it. But the housing can actually remain in place. I've seen videos where people have tried to remove that. But for this job, all you have to do is just detach that clamp and give yourself enough clearance to get the plenum up and around it. And you should be able to move it over to the right once that's done. Behind the plenum is a bracket that holds a blue and green wire harness. Here I am using a ratchet to detach that bracket from the back of the plenum. Here there's a green connector at the mass airflow sensor. That has been removed just to give us a little more clearance. So for the last portion of this video, you could see me making my way onto the back right portion of the plenum. There was a hose there that had antifreeze, so after I disconnected that, I had to plug that up. So one suggestion is, if you can, have a tarp under the car. I was able to clean that stuff off, but a little bit did drip underneath the car. So uh, plug that up, cover it, and move it off to the side. After that, you got the space now where you have access to the rear valve cover. You can see the coil packs there, and more than enough room for you to get in there and change that valve cover out. After completing the valve cover job, there were a couple of extra tips that I'd like to leave you. One, definitely have some anti-seize compound. Number two, for the RTV silicone, I put that in the valve cover before putting the valve cover gasket in place. That helps to hold the gasket in place before setting it back down on the engine. I can't stress the importance of having a good service manual. Number one, you'll have all your torque specifications there, and also the sequence that you need to bring those bolts down to ensure that you, number one, don't over torque those bolts and break them. There are a lot of horror stories out there you can read about on the web for those who didn't have the proper equipment when doing this job. Thanks for listening again. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them. I'll try to respond. And I look forward to making some more videos on this vehicle in the future for you. Thank you.